Hello, I'm Bernard Norcott-Mahany. I am your instructor for classical mythology, and I'm going to have each of the chapters, all but chapter 1 will be done as videos of PowerPoints so that you can follow along. And basically this would be as if you were like in a class and I were giving a lecture. So I'll expand on what's in the PowerPoint. This might help you in reviewing for tests. It might also help you just in learning the material. In some cases, if you don't have material, this would at least give you some information. So with that, without further ado, let's continue. Chapter 1 largely lays out how Maurizio organizes her material. So Lisa Maurizio is the author of Classical Mythology in Context, which is our text. She has each chapter divided into 4 sections. The first section is called History, and in chapters 2 through 13, this will feature some background information, and it will also have a particular Greek work, either selections from or the complete work in some cases, for you to read. And I do urge you in these in this opening section to definitely read the Greek stuff that's provided. It's all very good and it's worth your reading. So definitely, if you have to cut stuff, don't cut that. So the first section is the history. So let's look at what she has here in this introductory chapter. So talking about a author named William Bascom, who's an American anthropologist. Bascom, in his discussion of myth, because this slide, what is a myth? Myths have high emotional content. So, I mean, myths are a type of story, but they're not just any story. I mean, there are stories that one might read, like murder mysteries, that don't really have the sort of high emotional content. I mean, they're entertaining, they may have a point to make, but they're not sort of deep embedded in the myths would be that. Myths discuss the sacred. So most myths are going to deal somehow with the gods or with human relations with the gods in some way. And so to avoid that, so, contemporary romance novels would not so much be about the sacred, not be myths. And myths happen. So they happen basically in a sort of once upon a time land. And if you think of like the book of Genesis, the book of Genesis opens with the creation of the world and then the story of Adam and Eve in the garden. Those happen before history, right? Way back when. And in fact, in the Bible, what they do is you have that whole so-and-so had such and such sons. And the begats are basically to take it to a more historical period, right? So there's sort of a fade from the mythic historical present or near past. Don Cupid is a British theologian. Also, he agrees that myths discuss the sacred. They're focused on the gods. They represent traditional beliefs. Now, traditional beliefs is a sort of coded word. Also, if you hear of traditional stories, same thing. They deal with oral tradition. Tradition is not named, right? So if you've ever seen sheet music, such and such, and it says trad period, traditional. These are folk songs where we don't know who wrote the work. By the time we got it, it already don't have a named author we can actually point to. So traditional beliefs are beliefs that are passed on generation to generation to generation and don't have a quote-unquote leak. I mean, obviously there is, and so realistic, and are passed down by oral tradition. So Hesiod, the first author we're going to look at in chapter 2, and Homer, whom we'll look at, 2 authors, are both oral poets. What we have is a written text based on an oral tradition. As I some selections from the playwright Euripides. Euripides is very much got his own personal take on, and he's very much a literate author. We can point to Euripides' point of view. We can talk about Euripides' worldview, all that stuff. That is not so easy to do with Homer or Hesiod. We don't really know who they are. The names may actually be just constructs to represent the oral tradition. We do have a text, but the text was down probably generations after the authors themselves lived. So the slides that Maurizio provides have pictures which are also in your textbook. And here we have a bas-relief from an Etruscan sarcophagus made out of wood. So it's a wooden sarcophagus. Looks like it survived pretty well, which is somewhat surprising. Etruria is north of Rome in Italy, and stuff like wood does not do well because of the moisture of the climate, but it looks like this pretty well. But here we have Odysseus, the man on the left, our left, and this refers to the scene in Odyssey, book 11, where he travels to the edge of the world and he's told to sacrifice some rams to Hades, and he's supposed to dig a large pit, and the blood's going to go in the pit, and then the ghosts will come up from the ground, and when they drink from the blood, they'll be able to speak with him. And so this, of course, makes some sense. This might be a sarcophagus. Perhaps whoever was buried in this sarcophagus was he loved the Odyssey. I love the story, and of course, this is the moment where it deals with the dead. So this table here is also in your book on what is a myth, and it divides up 3 types of stories that we will see in this book that are sort of generally under myth. Legend and folktale are not technically myth the way it gets defined, but we will be looking at legend and folktale both. For instance, has a lot of folktale. Anything that has to do, we'll be looking at a few things by Roman authors. Anything that has to do with the Roman story, the story of Rome, is legend. It is tied to a historical fact, that of Rome. So let's look at the table. Myth is the belief system tied to myth is that myth tells what happened. So the Adam and Eve story, even if we sort of know based on science and everything else that the earth is more than 6,000 years old, and that the story of Adam and Eve is a story and not historical fact, it's presented as if it were historical fact, and it would have been believed that yes, God created Adam and Eve as to some sort of evolutionary process. The time is the remote past. It's actually like in the mists of time. This is way before anything that would constitute history or the historical narrative. The place can be a different world, right? So, for instance, the theogony, a lot of that takes place among the gods, and so even though Earth is a key figure in the theogony, it's sort of somewhere else. And even the Genesis, right, when God first develops the earth, right, and names things, he seems to be on a sort of different plane than the earth itself. Seems to be sort of like earth, but sort of somewhat separate. So the attitude, of course, of myth is sacred. These are stories that are tied to ritual, and they're tied to the gods in some way. The principal characters are non-human. They're often the gods. Legend. Now, legend, the belief is that it's fact. Now, again, legends are not as such. Two examples of legends. The George Washington, the cherry tree story. That, as far as we know, we have no evidence that actually happened. But it's presented as something that George Washington did when he was a kid. The story of Abraham Lincoln when he was a shopkeeper in Illinois. Well, he was a shopkeeper, but there's a story where someone was overcharged or something like that, and he walked 5 miles, 10 miles, or whatever to return, a nickel, a dime, some small amount, because he showed, again, that story, Abraham Lincoln is a historical person, so is George Washington. They really did exist. and that's what makes it legend. There is some tie to actual history, but the stories are still made up, but they're presented as if they're true. And any, I would say, any Hollywood movie that dealt with, like from the 30s and 40s and 50s, that dealt with American history, especially the Revolutionary War or the Revolutionary War, and even before the Civil War, there are events that are depicted that did actually happen, but they didn't happen exactly the way it's presented. And so all of those, I would argue, are sort of part of legend. Past, it's the historical past, where we actually can say that's history and not just story. The world of today, meaning the world we sort of live in. Now that Roman history goes back to, the oldest Roman history that we have that we can actually depend on is around 300, 200 BCE. Stuff before that is very much legendary in scale. But the world of today, so we're not dealing with like once upon a time. Secular or sacred can be the attitude. So legend can deal with the gods and their interrelationship with the humans. Moses, for instance, dealing with God. There you've got sort of God and a secular, historical event. The delivery from Egypt for the Jews. The principal characters, of course, are human. The focus of legend is human. It's basically history, but it's more story than history, but it's tied to history. And folktale is pure fiction. Folktale, like Paul Bunyan, have fantastic characters in the Odyssey. They're fiction. They're intended for entertainment. We're not expected to believe that it actually happened or even necessarily could have happened. Is any time, and it's often once upon a time, right? But it could, like for instance, the stories of Paul Bunyan are set in, as the United States is moving west. So it's set in the 19th century, and the Odyssey story is set right after the Trojan War. So we can figure out that sometime between like 1200 and 1150, that frame. So we can pinpoint it to a time, but it can be any time, and it can be even once upon a time. Again, the place is often relevant. It can be like, it's a small village and such and such. The attitude is secular. These are not sacred stories, non-human. So, like the Three Little Pigs would be an example of folktale that don't have any human characters in it. So, both Bascom and Cupid's definitions, they exclude myths in the form of visual art because they deal with stories, right? So I would argue they don't exclude myths in the form of poetry because all stories were actually told in verse. Poetry exists before prose. Prose is the limit. So I would argue it's a little bit misleading. But Bascom and Cupid's definitions do exclude myths in the form of like pictures, like the picture we saw of Odysseus slaying the ram, or plays. They see those not so much as representing myth. And in one sense, that's true. They're not. If you're taking myth as traditional tales are passed on. You don't have a particular author. In the case of drama, we have particular authors. Every play that we have, or even fragments of plays that we have, we know the author. So that's, they're not traditional. Works with a known author. So again, we're going to be looking at like Euripides versions of myths, and so they're often quite different, but they're also different than. So myth is, these are stories that are passed on orally. They gather stuff together. There's all sorts of stuff that gets added over time. And finally, someone around, and what we have is the written version, but it's quite a bit later. Stories that do not include supernatural beings. Bascom and Cupid are primarily looking at myths as theological, so they're not looking so much at some of the other stories. So, for instance, a lot are really about Rome's peculiar greatness, they're not going to really include those as myth to mythic thinking. And the stories did. So if the gods are not involved, Bascom and Cupid are not going to include those. William Doty, we'll see him later in the chapter on Hermes. He and a man named Hines did a work on tricksters. And Doty has a more inclusive definition that, the main thing that in the Doty description is the importance of the mythological corpus. So when you're looking at myths, you have to look at myths in the context of the whole mythological output of a culture, at least what we have. So we don't of Greek literature. We actually have we have a substantial fragment, a small fragment. It's less than 50%. We don't have all the stuff that was there. So consequently, we can't fully know. But we're going to get a better sense of a myth in the context of the mythological corpus, as large as you can get it. Myths can be told in many forms that are always rich in metaphors and symbols. For Doty, the key thing is that myth is sort of metaphoric in some way that's less. Like if you think of like a science book is trying to define terms and define processes. Those are not metaphoric. But metaphors, such as you find in poetry, that, of course, is what myths are all about, because they're sort of dreamy, and symbols as well. Myths are the values and meanings they promote. So that the way to think of myths is, what point do they have? What are they trying to sell? What's the outlook that they're pushing? Myths serve a purpose for societies. So for Doty, myths are tied to the groups that use those myths, and that of course will be society to society. All right, the second part of each chapter in the book is going to deal with theory, and what Maurizio does is she looks at so chapters 2 and 3, and then chapters 4 and 5, and then chapters 6 and 7. The chapters from now on, as far as theory goes, and we'll look at two sides of a particular question. So we might be looking at are myths particular or are myths universal, which in chapter 2 and chapter 3 we'll look at those particular myths from different lenses. Some will be from a structural lens, which will be looking at the language that's used and how myths are set up, how they are structured. So the actual way the story is told, more so than maybe what the story's about. And that's what happens in the theory section. So, from ancient Greece. Classical mythology refers to myths of ancient Greece and Rome. Now, in this class, at Greek myths, the Romans, as such, did not have myths. What the Romans had is legend, because everything for Romans is tied to Rome as a historicity. And so there are some stories that might be called Roman myths, but for the most part, it is tied to a historical context. Ancient Greece was not a nation, but refers to places where the Greeks lived. So when we talk about Greece, modern Greece has political boundaries. They're actually boundaries. You can cross from Greece into Albania or Greece into other places around, right? So Greece has a particular physical structure. When we look at maps of ancient Greece, it's not that way. The Athenians had different cultures. The Spartans and the Corinthians had different cultures. The Athenians and the Thebans had different cultures. All these city-states within the modern map of Greece were separate entities. They had their own sort of values. They had their own sort of agenda. Athens, for instance, was a democratic society after 500 BCE, whereas Sparta had two kings, was sort of more oligarchy type system, and then there were places that had a single monarch, maybe with great powers. So the values of each of those are going to be quite different. When we talk about Greeks as well, the term Greek originally to a particular group that lived in the area we called Greece. that term, Greek, stuck, referred to that whole area as Greece. So the word Greece and the word Greek is actually the Romans' use of a particular subgroup of the people. Is the Greeks and Greek literature and Greek language is an Indo-European language. So the Indo-Europeans were people who came from, they appear to have started somewhere in southern Russia, near where the Caucasus Mountains were, which is why these people, at one time they were, of course, the Nazis sort of ruined the use of that word, and sometimes people are called Caucasian. It all refers to sort of people who were, they could point to their origins as starting somewhere in that area. At some point, the Indo-Europeans spun to the east and went into India, and some spun into Europe, hence the term Indo-European. Most of the languages of Europe are Indo-European languages, meaning that they all ultimately came from this group. The Indo-Europeans invaded Greece sometime around 2000 BCE. All of Greek literature is in Greek, which is an Indo-European language, and reflects some of the values of were a nomadic warrior society, and they were a patriarchal society. So those values are all, again, the ancient Greeks, they were not a nation the way we think of it, but the Greeks whose language and literature was Indo-European, although there were natives as well, it was an intermixture, but the language is Indo-European. That's the sort of defining thing. So many of the poems that tell these myths originated in the Archaic period. This is the period from roughly 780 BCE up to about 480 BCE, so that 300-year period. The Iliad, the Odyssey, the Homeric hymns, some of the Homeric hymns. There are 31 Homeric, definitely written quite a bit later, and were written contemporaneous with the Iliad, the Odyssey, and Agony and Works and Days. We will be looking at some of the Homeric hymns. We will be looking at Hesiod's Theogony, Innocent. We will be looking at parts of the Iliad and the Odyssey. Sadly, we will not really be looking at the Works and Days. These were not considered sacred texts in our sense of the word. So the Greeks did not have a work like the Bible or like the Quran, right? These are sort of sacred. The ancients did not view the Iliad or Odyssey as a sacred text in the way that we would look at the Bible. But the ancients believed that when they thought of the gods in human form, primarily in terms of how they appear in the Iliad, the Odyssey, and in Hesiod's works. So Hesiod and Homer were key in how the Greeks sort of imagined their gods, and later authors, when they invoke the gods in some way, are looking back to Homer or Hesiod. Here we have a papyrus fragment of the Odyssey from the 3rd century BCE, and it's very fragmentary, but there are whole words, there are actually whole phrases that you can actually read here if we had a magnifying glass and could read Greek. I mean, I can read Greek, but this is going to be very difficult. Just studying this would know. And there are key phrases here that are definitely from the Odyssey. I mean, they should have been able to tell us exactly where in the Odyssey this appears, like what book and what lines, but they don't. So, and I don't know. I mean, it's too small and too difficult for me to read to know. In the classical period, so this is the period after about 330, Greeks began to examine their myths, expressing skepticism about the gods. So what happened? You get the beginnings of science, the beginnings of philosophy, and these are looking at myths, and they're trying to analyze them or determine what in fact they mean. Okay, so you get a sort of historicizing of myths where they take these fantastic stories and try to explain them. The tragedians wrote plays about the gods, and the tragedians are all Athenian. We have 3 tragedians who we have works from: Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides. we'll be looking at a play from Aeschylus, another one that's attributed to Aeschylus but may not be by him, and we'll be looking at Euripides. Sadly, Maurizio does not include Sophocles, whose most famous play, the Oedipus, would have been worth including, I think. The histories of Herodotus is credited with being the father of history. That may be an overstatement. Narrative that we can recognize a lot of stuff in there that is not. But Herodotus wrote a history of the war between Greece and Persia, and he sets it in a historical context. So he talks about in terms of other east-west battles in the Mediterranean. But Herodotus has stories in his histories where he's telling myths about the gods. Philosophers began to question myths using rationalism, and this becomes more and more the case, so that, you know, what some fantastic thing like, you know, Hercules doing such and such a deed is then try to be, how could that have happened actually? So they try to bring like science and other things to bear to explain how something could happen. One example, for instance, is book 3. Helen is watching the battle that Menelaus, her husband, is fighting with Paris, who is her Trojan husband. They are fighting to get Helen on the fields outside Troy, and she's looking from a wall above, and Aphrodite shows up and basically tells Helen to go to her bedchamber with Paris to go there and get herself all dolled up, and she's going to bring Paris to Helen. A rational explanation for that would be that she sees Paris, she just gets emotionally turned on by the whole thing, and therefore she wants to go and doll herself up. Now that's not the way it's presented, but that would be a way to sort of take and explain it rationally. During the Hellenistic period, this is from 330 on, Greek scholars began to collect myths. This is the period after Alexander the Great. Alexander set up a city in Alexandria, which had a gigantic library, like official texts, rather like the library of as much Greek literature as they could hold. Sadly, of course, that library burned during the civil wars. When Julius Caesar was in Egypt, the library, they still were able to reconstruct a lot of that stuff, but then when Christianity came in, a lot of the Greek myths, there was no need to hold on to them. Roman scholars continued this practice of recording antiquity. Of course, by 30 BC, Rome controls the entire Mediterranean, and even though the Greek is still the official language in the Eastern Mediterranean, it's under Roman authority, and the Romans, of course, have an interest in maintaining this because they see themselves as the sort of arbiter and guardian of the tradition. By the 5th century CE, so the Roman Empire now is officially Christian, the emperor is Christian, and the Christianity, the mythological system becomes quiescent. It sort of goes underground because he is now the true religion, and therefore all this other stuff is nonsense. It is interesting. I mean, I find it interesting that both for the Romans and for the Greeks, there was an interest in maintaining some level of this literature. So the value of the literature was seen, even if the belief system behind it was not valued. Which is striking, right? Because they could have just said, well, all that stuff are just lies, and we're just going to get rid of it all. They didn't, but of course it's not going to be as high a priority, and so a lot of minor authors or lesser authors we don't have anything of. Throughout, Maurizio has these maps. Don't find generally that helpful. This map is fairly good in giving us a sense. So what we've got here is we've got Greece, which is right here, just under Macedonia. That's Greece. Over here is Troy. You can see Troy on the map. In Anatolia, the Levant will be important. This is where the Phoenicians lived. There, ancient Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq is over here. Egypt. All of these we will be looking at some stories from these different cultures. Um, so in the third part, we're going to look at myths from other lands for comparison. Most of them are going to come from the Levant, from the Near East, because that would be important. It's older than, right? Remember, the Indo-Europeans invaded around 2000. A lot of this stuff in the Middle East, the Near East, is actually much older than that. Now, the written texts we have may not be older than that, but they go back to older stories. So, Greece was a relative newcomer compared to the empires of the ancient Near East. Empire, Mesopotamia, there was an empire. The Hittite Empire controlled most of Anatolia. You also had the Phoenicians, who were they were a mercantile empire, and then Egypt. The Hittite Empire ruled Anatolia, that area that's modern-day Turkey, from the 18th through the 14th century BCE. And we have the Hittite language. A fair amount was actually preserved. I had a professor once who studied Hittite, said it's fairly easy, but it's partly easy because so much of Hittite was used for documentation of like records, and so they have a certain formula, right? And you get into the habit of reading those. There are some Hittite stories, though. There's a creation story similar to Hesiod's Theogony, where you've got dynastic battle between an older generation of gods with a newer generation of gods. The Hittites may have had contact with the early kings of Troy. We do have documents that are in Hittite where they refer to Alexandros, who is a prince from Wilusa, is thought to be the Hittite word for Ilion, which is another word for Troy. That's why the Iliad is called the Iliad, because it's the poem about Troy. Alexander is another name for Paris in the Iliad, and so it might very well be that the Alexander they refer to refers to a historical figure, even though, of course, he's just a character in the Iliad. There may have been an actual Paris. And here we've got tile and brick from around 575 BC from Belian. This is near the Ishtar Gate, goddess of the Babylonians. The religious and cultural ideas of the Levant, that's Phoenicia, were spread throughout the Mediterranean by the Phoenicians, who were great traders. Right? They had a tremendous trading empire and actually traded all over the Mediterranean, all the way to Spain. And they would carry their stories with them. As cultures sort of intermix with one another, they start picking up these stories and including them in their own mythology. The Israelite residents of the Levant were isolated by their monotheistic beliefs. So the Jews, because they had a single bank of stories that the others did, but they also were not looked at as models by the polytheistic societies, right? So Greece could look at the gods of the Phoenicians or the Babylonians and say, yeah, they're basically our gods. They couldn't look at the Jewish god, that's our gods, because it's a single god, right? It doesn't match up. There are some similarities between Greek and Hebrew ideas of a moral universe. That happens more later. I'm not sure. I mean, Hesiod has some elements of that. There are some elements in Homer, but it doesn't become quite as fixed until later. But the story of the flood, which seems to have started as a Babylonian or Mesopotamian story, the flood story is both in Genesis, right, the Noah and the flood, and there's also a Greek version, Deucalion and the flood. So that flood story does seem to have spread all about. The Epic of Gilgamesh is chapters 10 and 12, but it was written down during the Babylonian period in a language called Akkadian. So the Akkadians took over ancient Sumer, and they kept the stories, but of course put it in their own language. So with the Epic of Gilgamesh, we do have, it's an Akkadian version of the Sumerian myth. The Epic of Gilgamesh and the Epic of Atrahasis, which is a Babylonian story, have similar narrative patterns to Greek myths. Gilgamesh, in some ways, is a lot like Achilles, the Greek hero. So, and the Atrahasis story as well has similarities to, which again may indicate these people had, and the Phoenicians were trading all over the place, and they were basically telling these stories that the Greeks, thought, we can sort of do that too. So this may have been, definitely an in-mix of different things. Early contact between Greece and Egypt is well documented, and scholars question how much African influence through Egypt made its way into Greece. There is a book we'll look at in chapter 6 called Black Athena by a man named Bernard. And Bernard's, it was a 3-volume work. His claim was that the goddess Athena was actually an African goddess who, made it to Greece and made it into the pantheon. I'm not exactly sure where, as far as general scholarship, how much people feel that that's accurate, but that the Egyptians had an effect on Greece is clear. Myths from ancient Rome. Again, the Romans didn't really have myths. What they did have was they had legends. What some people look at, like the Roman poet Ovid, who did do a lot of myths. Well, he based myths. He changed them a little bit because he's a Roman, so he's going to look at them with different eyes. But they're Greek stories. They're Roman versions of Greek stories, just like there are Hollywood movies of Greek myths that have a lot of the facts are from the Greek myths, but of course a filmmaker would make it so they have an American quality even if they're still Greek myths. So that's sort of the stories that sometimes get called Roman myths are really just Greek stories that the Romans have taken over and transformed. Roman stories like Romulus and Remus predate contact with the Greeks, but most Roman myths have obvious Greek origins. Again, what I mentioned before, keep that in mind. Most Roman myths are not sacred narratives, but this does not make them not myths. Again, they're legends. They're tied to the fact that Rome is a historical entity, and more than anything else, Romans loved Rome. I mean, for the Romans, Rome, the presence of God on earth. So it's a different, when you've got that fixation, it's going to turn legends may have a mythic quality, but they're still going to be legends more than myths. Here, we've got, I don't know when this particular thing was made, but there is a bronze statue of this she-wolf that it's called the Capitoline Wolf, and Michelangelo, Ulo's time period, sculpted Romulus and Remus and put them underneath the wolf. And this is just a copy of that scene. So the boys were actually added quite a bit later, and so this particular figure here is not an ancient figure somewhere in Rome. But that image of the she-wolf, that is appears on the seal of the city of Rome. It's very much sort of like a Roman image. Involves what I used to call, it's not my term, Nachleben, which is the German word. It means afterlife. And this is what happens to mythic stories, what happens to old stories when they get retold by later societies, right? So Hercules, the Disney Hercules movie, would be an example of Nachleben of the Hercules story. It is Hercules. The figure is an ancient figure, but the telling of it in Disney's film has more to do with Disney than it has to do with it. So each chapter is divided into 4 sections. I already mentioned this. This would be the 4th part. History, form, and content of the myth, the Greek myth, and provides an overview of the chapter's subject. Theory surveys the theoretical lens of looking at myth. Comparison looks at myths from neighboring societies, primarily from the Near East, but also some Roman stuff and some Egyptian stuff. And reception studies modern and contemporary art that depicts and interprets Greek myths. And this will be art, this will be film, this will be drama, this will be poems. And here we've got the reception section. Why study classical myths? And still informs how we view for a century, according to philosopher Mary Midgley. So Mary Midgley wrote a work called The Myths We Live By. And she is actually looking at myth in a somewhat different way. So she's looking at myths as a sort of system of belief that's underneath the radar. For example, in the United States, we tend to value those founding documents and the founding fathers. Well, the founding fathers were part of a cultural movement called the Enlightenment. And so Enlightenment thinking is a whole lot of value on the individual as opposed to society as a whole, right? The rights of the individual. Well, the rights of the individual are, there's nothing wrong with the rights of the individual. As a, this is a clear right, and it's not, our way of looking at the world, but naturally true, then you might say the right then the rights of the group, which might run counter to the rights of the individual, then they're suspect. Or you might say you are a wealthy person and you own a lot of land and you decide you want to mine the land, but if you mine the land, it's going to destroy the land, but it's yours to do because as an individual have these rights. Again, nature, the Enlightenment does not really, it talks about nature, but it doesn't value the natural world quite so much as we might do today. Those myths still hold for us, or the myth of the individual, the rugged individual, right? So who makes the difference? That's a big thing in U.S. thinking, right? Westerns are pretty much based on it, right? You've got the loner in the West, and the loner is the one who's always right, and society is often wrong. Well, that can lead you to a situation where everyone does whatever they want, and no matter what the car. Well, that's not. I mean, there are consequences to that thinking. So, at any rate, that's what Midgley is looking at. So she's not really looking at myth. Since might mean it in it like a story about Zeus. Is the first step toward not being controlled by them. I mean, that's the whole point, I think, of education. What's the point is to become a critical consumer, right? So when you look at something, when you look at a TV show, when you look at news, when you look at anything, you can look at it with a critical eye so that you're not sucked in by the rhetorical devices that are designed to get you all caught up, and then suddenly you're believing the point of view that's being pushed. Right? That's how propaganda works. It gets you sort of emotionally involved, and then you're carrying a flag for Hitler. So being critical towards them, knowing how they work their magic, keep them from actually taking over. So here we have a work by Romar. Burden was primarily a collagist. This is a collage. And here we've got Odysseus entering the underworld. So this is different, really, than the Odyssey, but he's looking a lot at African and Caribbean ways of looking at things and incorporating that with the story of the Odyssey in this series that he did of collages. But you've got Odysseus coming in to the underworld, and there are figures here that are, they're not part of the Greek. They are sort of tied to African and Caribbean death in the underworld.